Great. Okay, so I'm recording, so the first question is easy, no referring to anyone. If you could just start off giving us your name and what it is that you do now, what you used to do.
I'm Bill Moomaw. I'm a climate scientist, and I am Professor Emeritus from Tufts University and Distinguished Visiting Scientist at Woodwell Climate Research Center.
Okay, you said you were going to start off with a statement by the IPCC. Can you go into that and tell us why it's relevant?
All right. The recent IPCC report starts off with a remarkable statement that when we burn our fossil fuels and put the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the increase is substantially less than what we put in. And a major portion of that removal is by forests on land. They're removing more than a quarter of all the carbon dioxide that we put in from our fossil fuels. There's a huge emphasis on technologies that will reduce emissions, and that's certainly important and essential. But there's been very little discussion about how we might take advantage of this free service that forests provide and even have it increase, because forests are probably removing less than half of and storing less than half of what they're capable.
Can you talk about the permanence of carbon storage in forests,
Yeah,
and why it's necessary to emphasize the stringent protection of old-growth forests and not just replanting?
Particularly in North America, Europe, and Australia, where we've practiced sustainable forestry, which is really just sustainable timber production, because forests aren't sustainable in that practice. It's simply a way of keeping enough trees growing to harvest them at the next harvest time. And the way in which forests store carbon is they remove carbon dioxide by photosynthesis, combine carbon dioxide with water, energy from the sun, and it produces sugars, which are converted into the fibers of wood, and some of it for the energy of running the cells of the tree. And as the reason that we're seeing this extra removal beyond what trees need for their own functioning is that forests are growing. And we have, by harvesting so frequently, we never let trees in the forest get very big. And it is the big trees that store a disproportionate amount of the carbon. So if we look at our remaining old-growth forests, they will have many times more carbon stored than you will find in trees that are harvested on a 40 or 50 or 70-year cycle. And where is it stored? Well, it's stored half the weight of wood, of dry wood, is carbon. Then there's additional carbon in the soils. And as forests get older, and the trees and needles fall and the branches fall and decay, they become soil carbon. And the older the forest, the more carbon there is in the soils. And in many older forests, there's actually more carbon per acre, per hectare, in the soils than there is in the living trees. So a forest is a complex ecosystem with the components being not just the plants, but the pollinators, the animals, the birds, the fungi. In fact, we've discovered in only the last 20 years or so that soil fungi play an incredibly important role in bringing nutrients to trees. And those fungal networks basically disappear when forests are harvested. And it takes decades, maybe longer, for them to develop. So the functionality of a real forest ecosystem depends upon its being allowed to remain as an intact forest. And the older the forest, the more carbon it's stored. And people think, well, those trees will die. It's true, some of them will die. but many of them have life expectancies of 200 to 400 years, and we're harvesting them every 50. And studies we've done show that 70% or more of the carbon that a large old tree that's, say, 150 years old was accumulated after it was 50 years old, at the time it would have otherwise been harvested. And 150 years old is not really an old forest. Many forests have, many of the remaining primary forests have trees in them that are 400 years old, 500 years old, and of course the sequoias and the redwoods are 2,000 years old. And by the way, they're still growing and they're still accumulating carbon, and they're still accumulating carbon in the soils. It's still increasing even in these old forests.
Can I just ask, was the noise okay on that?
Yeah, just
Okay. So where we live in the Pacific Northwest rainforests, we do have ghosts of stumps of western red cedar and Douglas fir that were close to 1,000 years old. Can you give us any personal or specific examples of what happens when a tree of that age is cut down?
Okay. When trees are harvested and turned into wood, it's often claimed that the wood is storing carbon. And it is, at least for a while. But what's not often mentioned is that there is more carbon that is released as carbon dioxide when a tree is cut than is stored in the lumber or the final object. So if you had a 1,000-year-old tree and it was harvested and turned into lumber, you have basically released more than half of the carbon that was in that tree that took 1,000 years to accumulate. There is no way to grow a 1,000-year-old tree in less than 1,000 years. So it really is, we are making what in human terms is an irreversible change. We're not going to get it back, not just in our lifetime, but remember, if a generation that's 40 generations in 1,000 years. So it's a very, very long time. And so what we need to do is to maintain these older forests and make sure that we have enough of them to store and accumulate enough carbon that we can begin to reverse the amount of carbon dioxide that's growing in the atmosphere, not just hold it constant, because it's way too high already. And we need to be removing it. A lot of money's being spent to develop technologies to do this. They'll be very energy intensive, they'll be very expensive, and I'm skeptical that they can be distributed at scale to come anywhere near what forests are doing right now. By the way, forests work 7 days a week and throughout the year in many places, and they're storing it for free and they're removing it for free. Because of the degradation we have done to the climate, to the biosphere, we need a full toolbox of actions to reverse it. Because we are a technologically heavily dependent society, those technologies have to be changed, no question about it. But what has been neglected is the powerful role that natural systems play. So we need to, in the case of forests, we need to let more of them grow. There's a lot of talk about planting trees. Well, if you plant a tree today, it will do nothing by 2030, very little by 2050, and even by 2100 it will do very little. But a tree that's growing today will accumulate huge amounts of carbon by those dates. We call that process of letting forests grow to achieve their potential for accumulating carbon, proforestation, which is far better than, we should reforest for sure, but will bring in more carbon per unit area than will planting trees. we need to use multiple strategies and tools to address the climate problem. And that includes reducing the impact from our activities, from our emissions. It includes protecting the natural systems that are actually helping us by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and reducing the emissions that come from harvesting forests, for example. And finally, oh wait, I'm sorry, I forgot what the third one was.
Oh, the climate restoration.
Oh, climate, yes.
The actual
Yeah,
removal
yeah,
of carbons.
And we need to sorry, I'm trying to think of a way to say this. And we need to be actively removing carbon through natural processes. Today, scientists have realized that issues like the other emergencies, biodiversity loss, for example, and climate degradation are two parts of the same problem, and we cannot address them separately. The recent IPCC report said very bluntly, sustaining ecosystems and biodiversity is fundamental to resilient development because of their role in mitigation and adaptation of climate change.
On a personal level, what keeps you awake at night, if indeed it does? What's your personal view on where we're at and the chances of us succeeding?
I think what worries me the most is the way we have basically tried to keep doing what we're doing and finding excuses for not changing it, and for putting out lots of false information about what is happening and how we need to address it. The thing that is really troubling is that as the Earth gets warmer, it causes more warming, whether that's the melting of the ice and permafrost in the north, leading to release of more methane and less reflectivity of sunlight from ice and snow, or whether it is the rise in sea level. Those will not be solved over the next 1,000 years unless even if we stop today. But we can make it a lot less if we act today, and I think that's essential. But it's these feedback loops that worry me the most, the amplifying feedbacks that make the warming we already are causing directly be multiplied many times over. And those are if those get too far, we won't be able to turn them off. And we will be living in a hothouse hell.
So one last sentence from my side. We can't solve this with the same mindset.
Oh, that's a good
type of
one.
thing.
Yeah. We need to think in new ways. We cannot solve today's problems using the same thought process that caused them. We have to think in new ways to meet all the needs that we have. And one of those needs we have to realize is protecting the Earth's climate and biodiversity, which is what sustains us and allows us to live on this wonderful planet, the only one in the universe we know of that has life.
A very last modification on that, but on a personal level, you've said what we need to do, but this hasn't really been about the science for a long time. It's a behavioural issue. So knowing what we need to do, but what do you think we will do? What do you think our chances are personally?
Years ago, people asked me, when did I think we would start doing something about climate change? And I said, sadly, we'll start doing something about climate change when we're really suffering really severe adverse consequences. Well, we're there. And potentially this could motivate us to take action. I'm hopeful that it will. I am very disappointed that we've had so many people have had to suffer, and so much of nature has to have been destroyed for us to realize that we really do have to change our ways.